Okay. So I really like that you've worked on properties that have been made into comics from other media, and you've also made comics that have made the transition to television or film.
Yeah.
When looking at such translations such as Doctor Who,
Mhm.
Supernatural, and X-Men, which you've worked on, what is your method to adapting work, and what do you hope to see in others' adaptations of things that you've worked on?
Well, it's funny. I mean, there's always been kind of a stigma to what we call licensed properties. You know, I grew up reading the Star Wars comic book. I mean, that literally was my very first comic book. But I think a lot of times we look down a little bit on things that are being translated into comics, and I avoided doing them for most of my career. It really wasn't until Ben Abernathy at Wildstorm called me up and asked if I'd be interested in doing Supernatural that I gave it a go. And the interesting thing about the approach they took on Supernatural was they specifically told me, you know, we don't want it to look exactly like the actors. We're not going for a photorealistic representation of them. You know, we want it to look like a Matt Smith character, but be close enough that you knew which character from the show it was. So it was a really interesting approach, and I had a good time doing it because I'm not the best at photo likenesses. So you know, we experimented a little bit just to get it close, and it felt
Hello? Oh,
where you know there's a lot of shadows, there's monsters, there's creepy things. It's all the stuff that I feel is some of my what I guess you would call is in my ballpark. I mean that's the stuff that I love to draw. So it was a lot of fun to do. And then when I went on to doing once I had sort of started down the road of doing licensed projects, suddenly I was getting all these licensed projects, and none of them were really that uptight about the likenesses. I mean, I was more uptight about the likenesses for Doctor Who than I think IDW and the BBC were, because I'm a huge Doctor Who fan.
well, and I think you draw a
So
fine David Tennant, so.
it was fun because David Tennant kind of looks like me a little bit, so so I was able to like use my hair for reference and stuff. But it was fun, and but I really, you know, I really struggled.
Hello? I lost
Did
you
you
a little
lose
bit
me?
there.
You were cutting out there for a second.
Okay. Hello? Hello?
Which was, you know, was the early '90s. You know, we didn't use computers for anything other than writing scripts. So now, you know, we used to send, you draw the page, you'd send it to your editor, usually in New York, and they'd send it to the inker or whatever. And now, you know, we all do at least some part of the production process on a computer. I mean,
Yes. Well,
I don't even.
mhm. Well, and like
No,
there's
I was
purists one way and the other, so it's interesting to see.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's amazing. It's amazing to see some of the guys who can work directly on the computer, like Pete Woods now is doing everything on the computer, and you know he gets you know stunningly natural looking pages and with the computer. And you know, if I try to use a computer to draw something, it looks like a 6-year-old is trying to draw a comic book. It doesn't look that good. But anyways, so
Okay, so
are we we're back? Where are you
we're
now?
back. I actually recorded that last little bit, so I might include that because
Yeah,
it's
feel
good
free.
to look at the
Well,
history. Hmm.
what I was saying about the license stuff is that what I try to do, I don't go for an exact likeness. What I try to do is what I like to call an emotional likeness. Like the character is going to move in a certain way that you're going to recognize from the TV or from the movie. And I put a lot of thought because I mean I'm not that great at likenesses. I can get it close, because you're never going to get it to look. You're never going to get a comic book drawing to look like what you're seeing on the television. And I think that if you're trying to make it look like what you're going to see on television, I think you're kind of missing the point of what comics is capable of. You can tell a very different kind of story. You can tell a story with more layers than in a 1-hour comic book or a 1-hour TV show. It's if you're going to do a comic book based on a TV show, make the best comic book that you can. So, and it actually has been very good for my career. I mean, I literally have been working nonstop since agreeing to do Supernatural, and now I'm doing Doctor Who more or less full time, which was that's my dream gig.
Mm-hmm.
When they announced they were going to do the new Doctor Who show, I was actually the Doctor Who show had been going for a year or so, and I was talking to Ben Abernathy at Wildstorm over the phone, and this was after Supernatural, and Ben saying, what is there? This licensed project comic thing is working out pretty well. Is there anything else that you'd be interested maybe in working on? And I was like, you guys got to get the Doctor Who license because I want to work on Doctor Who. And Ben said, oh, actually, no, the IDW guys just picked it up. And, I mean, this literally was, very, very early days. And I'm having this conversation with Ben Abernathy at DC Wildstorm while emailing the head of IDW, or the head editor at IDW, Chris Rael, saying, I will work on Doctor Who for free because I love Doctor Who so much. Wrapped up the conversation with Ben, and in the same space of time, got an email back from Chris saying, yeah, well, we already have something set up, we already have an artist, but I'll keep you in mind. And it took a couple years for us to line up our schedules, and finally, Ben Tipton, who took over as the editor of all the Doctor Who projects, called me up and asked me if I would be interested in drawing a story. And it's one of those things where, as an editor, he felt, I was like, well, we're doing different artists on each story arc, and I've got a story arc that's a couple of issues, and I've got a story arc that's 4 issues. Which one would you prefer? And it's like, I'll take the 4 issues, please. So, and that, worked out pretty well, went over well with the fans, and so they keep bringing me back. So I'm not sure what to call myself on this book, but I'm kind of calling myself the semi-regular artist, because I did 2 story arcs in Volume 1, and I'm doing 2 story arcs in Volume 2, and then I wrote and drew a story for last year's annual, and drew another story for last year's annual.
Cool. So, kind of going with that kind of same thing with the controversy in comics, you've worked on both corporate and creator-owned titles. And could you give us some insight into the creative benefits or some hurdles that you found in each?
I started out doing creator-owned comics at Caliber, which was great because you had an incredible amount of freedom, and I could write and draw my own stuff. I could do the kinds of stories that I wanted to do. But there's a drawback, which was particularly, even in the early 90s, where the comic book industry was much bigger than it is now in terms of the size of the audience. Even then, you weren't really making much money unless somebody, optioned your comic to be a movie. I think I only got one real royalty check from all of the comic books that I did early in my career that were creator-owned books. And the goal then was very much to do a creator-owned book, break into DC or Marvel or Dark Horse at that time. And then you went on to do corporate comics, and you didn't have any rights. And if they made a movie based on the comic book that you were making, you didn't really make any money. I'm not quite sure what the controversy is now. I mean, I know Steve Niles was really pushing pushing some of the creator-owned stuff, and my friend Josh Filekoff has done much like what we were doing in the early days. He did a lot of creator-owned stuff, did very well with it, and then now he's using that to catapult himself into a career at DC Marvel and Top Cow. It's you almost these days you almost can't talk about creator-owned comics and corporate comics without addressing digital comics.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people are really I'm not sure what the right word would be. Everyone's a little uneasy about digital comics, and I love digital comics. I am a big fan of being able to write and draw your own material and publish it yourself for next to no money at all. One of the DC and Marvel, Dark Horse, even Image, though, if you have a professional-looking book, Image, it's relatively easy to get published by Image. But there's really something to be said for being able to do all that yourself and not having to rely on a larger company to accept and publish it for you. So it's going to be really interesting to see how that changes the material. Ron Mars on Twitter, because he likes messing with people on Twitter, mm-hmm. has made the point several times, and I would tend to agree with him, that we've really limited ourselves in the comic book industry in terms of the kinds of material we put out there, which is both true and not true. There's a lot of different kind of material out there, but our bread and butter is, and probably will always be, superheroes. Mm-hmm. And it's like things like CrossGen were an interesting experiment in. This is kind of a superhero comic book, but we're going to go into different genres. We did pirates, we did Victorian mysteries, we did the book that Ron and I worked on together, The Path, which is a samurai book. There are places. There are places you can go with a comic book that we are very hesitant to go because it costs a lot of money to print a comic book, and you need to have you need to try and do something that you think is gonna make some money, frankly. And the nice thing about digital comics and doing all that stuff yourself is it costs next to nothing to make. So as long as you're willing to do it for relatively little money, you can do whatever you want and try to build up an audience that way. So it's very, very interesting. I'm a big fan, as someone who writes and draws, draws and writes whenever I get a chance to. I'm a big proponent of doing creator-owned material, and I've done very little of it in my career since making the leap from Caliber to DC in the 90s. I've done very little because the reality is when you're drawing comics full time, you got to keep a roof over your head. Mm-hmm. So you're drawing whatever someone is willing to pay you to draw, which sounds incredibly cynical, and perhaps it is, but it's a funny kind of way to make a living. Mm-hmm. And sometimes, if you're working at the art table, just trying to keep up with the deadlines from 12 to 16 hours a day, 7 days a week, there's not always a lot of time to sit and draw a creator-owned thing. I've done a few things kind of on the side, like Astronauts in Trouble, that I did with Larry Young, which was a great book. Not for the art. The writing was great. I wasn't that great. And a couple of other things that I've just written here and there. But it's really hard to find time to do things like that when you're trying to make a living doing it. So I'm not sure if that addressed the controversy.
No, I think it's less of a controversy and more of a fan argument. But
yeah. There's a good friend of mine who is a a young adult writer. He writes a series of books called Generation Dead. His name's Daniel Waters. He's a great writer. He's a good friend of mine. And, Dan and I have talked a few times about if you won the lottery and you just got ridiculous, like Stephen King amounts of money, what would you do? And the thing that I always say that I would do is I would buy DC Comics, which would mean I'd have to win a very, very large lottery.
Yes.
I'd buy DC Comics. I'd stop publishing all of their books and then restart them. Because I know the fans love continuity, and I love the continuity. I mean, I'm a huge Legion of Superheroes fan, and that book is all about continuity. But I think we really get bogged down in it. It's very hard for us to reach an audience outside of the already established and very, very faithful audience. It's great to have those people. I mean, Lord knows this is what keeps the comic book industry going right now. But it'd be really nice if we could reach out, bring some other people back in who don't need to know, the history of, each character, Green Lantern or anybody. I just use Green Lantern as an example because, you have the Green Lantern movie coming out soon. Wouldn't it be great to have some people see the movie and be like, that's a really interesting character, and then have a Green Lantern book that they could get into? And I'm not sure, not for lack of trying, I'm not sure how accessible a lot of the comic books that we do are to an audience that isn't already reading comics. And it's a business issue, but it's also a creative issue. And the people who are writing these books, writing and drawing these books, have to keep in mind that you need to appeal to an audience that doesn't know the history. And a lot of, there are certain guys, Jeff Johns being a perfect example, who can kind of balance those two things and have a book be a little more accessible to an audience outside. But I want to see books that you can bring somebody who's never seen a comic book before, has no idea who any of these characters are. Let's have that book that brings that person in and gets them interested in comics. And I think that's one of the potentials of digital comics, because with all respect to the comic book shops, which again are our bread and butter, without comic book shops, there is no comic book industry at the moment. A lot of people aren't going to go into a comic book shop to buy a comic. When I was a kid, we used to buy them at newsstands, which was hilarious because you never knew what issues they were going to have. So you'd have, a 7-issue run of Legion of Superheroes, and then there'd be like a 4-part story in Legion of Superheroes, but you were missing like part 3 because the corner store never got that. But now that we're so in those days, anyone would just be in a little drugstore or whatever and pick up a comic. But now you have to go, more often than not, you have to go to a comic book shop. So by having things that you can have delivered directly to a digital device, a lot of people can just buy comics without having to go into a comic book shop. And we need to have the kind of material available that is going to appeal to those people as well. Bring them in, get them in the comics. Just start them out reading in the format, and then start feeding them things like Watchmen, start feeding them things like Sandman, and then leading back into superheroes or whatever they're interested in. That's the potential of digital comics. How well we take advantage of that is going to be the question of the next 10 years in the comic book industry.
Here's my segue question. As both a writer and artist, how do you see art as a narrative medium in comics, and what have you learned from the many writers that you have collaborated with?
Well, it's funny. I've worked with some of the best writers in comics.
Mm-hmm.
And that sounds like I'm just trying to be nice, but it's true. I got to work with Alan Moore on some issues of Supreme. I got to work with James Robinson on Starman, which, for my money, was the best superhero comic from the 1990s. I've worked with Ron Mars. The only one I haven't worked with is Neil Gaiman, in my personal pantheon of great writers. And I've learned something from all of them. Comic books, a lot of times people compare comic books to movies because movies are a blend both of writing, dialogue, and visuals. But it's not really quite accurate. I mean, yeah, we have visuals and we have words, but there's a dynamic to how those things play off of each other on a printed page that you don't get from a movie. And it seems to me like the newer generation of comic book writers who come in are more and more heavily influenced by television and movies, because we don't really use captions all that much anymore,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is a shame, because that's one of the things you can do with comics that you can't really do in any other medium. Is you can do captions, you can do thought balloons. We don't want to kind of lose some of those devices that we're the only people that this is the only medium that they really work in. It's funny because when I first started at Caliber way back when, I thought I was a great writer. I thought I was a genius. And it's been a process of, I've been drawing comics now professionally for 18 years, literally this month. It's been a long process of learning that actually I can't really write that well, because you're working with these guys like James Robinson, who, James thinks about stories in just an amazing and original way, and seeing the process, the process of bringing one of his scripts and turning it into a comic book just teaches you so much about how you tell a story. I don't think of myself as a very flashy artist. I'm much more interested in telling the story as best I can. Because frankly, I wanted to be when I got into comics, I wanted to be a writer, but I could kind of draw, and so I would draw my own stories. This was when I was in college, and then so when I started out, I was writing and drawing my own stories, and then suddenly the art stuff kind of took off. I was working at DC. I was starting to work at Marvel. I eventually went on to work for literally everybody, every major American publisher. But I've always thought of myself kind of as a writer who drew. So I approach the art side of things very differently, probably, than most artists. I'm not looking for, the big splash image. I'm looking for the emotional content that you're trying to convey, which is fun. And maybe if I was a little splashier, it would be much richer. But it's fun. Most storytelling mediums don't have this level of collaboration between people. So it's a really interesting medium to work in, because particularly someone like Ron Mars, we just did, we had done the Path together at CrossGen, and then we just did 2 issues of Witchblade together. And the interplay between both of us, I think, really helps make the story better. Ron was trying to play to my strengths. I know, Ron and I were talking about the story. We were talking about it, from the very early stages, putting the story together. So he could make it play to my strengths. And I'm so familiar with the way he writes that I was able to understand what he was trying to convey and kind of punch it up. And, you can't do that in movies. You can't can't do that in television, or if you can, it's really incredibly rare to have, you know, that kind of collaboration for people. So it's always interested me. Every situation that I come in where I'm working with a different writer is interesting and different. And, the dynamic is going to be different on every project. Some guys you work with real closely, and some guys, frankly, just kind of look at you as I'm. Here's what I wrote. You just draw it. But I've been lucky. I've been lucky that for most of my career, I've worked with writers who really, who get comics and get the idea of it's a collaboration, and are willing to work very closely to, try and make something good.
So your next project that you're promoting and trying to get up off the ground is Nightfolk, which is not collaboration. This is all you, correct?
Yeah,
Yes.
This is me being an egomaniac saying, I have a story to tell, and I am going to tell it.
That's fine. Can you tell me a little bit about it and how it became kind of your all-encompassing priority endeavor? What was the point that you decided to focus yourself more solely on that project? Because I know that's kind of what you're wanting to do with the Kickstart campaign.
Well, about 5 or 6 years ago, I decided, possibly incredibly pretentiously, I decided to put a little more effort, spend a little more time with my writing, because, like I said, I hadn't really intended to end up as a comic book artist. At best, I kind of wanted to write and draw my own material, if not just write it and have other people draw it. So after, it was about 13, 14 years of drawing comics, I'd kind of gotten to the point where, I still had all these stories I really wanted to tell, and I just didn't have time to do any of them. I'm not an incredibly fast artist. I have decent speed, sort of once, or I have a decent, once I get up to speed, I can really crank out pages, but it takes me a while to kind of get up to speed. So it's not the best situation for someone who, who wants to write and draw something on the side. So I took a break from comics for a few years, and I started studying writing prose, because I thought that I had a story in me. Which again sounds pretentious, but I had a lot of ideas that were bouncing around in my head. There were a lot of things that I really kind of wanted to say, and I kind of wasn't seeing any of those. I didn't see an opportunity for those things in comics. I was very influenced by the early Vertigo stuff, Sandman, Alan Moore's run on Hellblazer, and kind of nobody's really doing those sorts of stories in comics anymore. Everything's a little darker, a little more twisted. So I figured maybe I could do it as prose. I could learn how to write prose, and I started studying it really intensely for several years, doing writers' workshops and going to a lot of writers' conferences, things like that, and kind of building up the skill set for writing prose. It actually turned out it went pretty well, and I very quickly was starting to have some success, or at least very, very positive reactions to what I was doing. But I hadn't kind of figured out what I was going to write. I just was figuring out how to write, and I was at a writer's workshop with F. Paul Wilson. F. Paul Wilson was one of the teachers, who I'm a huge fan of, and Paul was familiar with some of the short stories I'd done in Negative Burn, featuring my character Evan Fade, and I'd sent some to him, and he was very positive about them. And he looked at what I had brought to this writers' workshop and was basically like, this is good, but why aren't you doing Fade stories? And I was sort of standing there talking to him, going, yes. Why didn't I do a Fade story? And so the next time down and get serious about writing a novel, I started trying to figure out what kind of story I would tell, and knowing that it was going to be something much like my Fade stories. In fact, I'm working on a Fade novel now, but it's slow going because I'm working full time in comics, and in fact busier now than ever. So I kind of had to make the decision that I needed to do something shorter. I needed to do something, I needed to find a way to fund working on it. So, which is where the Kickstarter thing came in. A couple of my friends, Tony Harris and Ian Struckoff, had used Kickstarter to finance their personal projects. Ian started his own comic book company, essentially called Black Label Comics, and is doing a couple of books that are, and he raises money for the printing of each one of those books on Kickstarter. And then Tony just recently used Kickstarter to finance the samurai book called Round Eye that he's doing, which looks amazing. And I kind of started thinking, well, maybe I could use it to finance work on a novel. So I took one of the ideas that ties into my Fade stories, which is this project, the project you mentioned, Nightfolk, which is sort of, I guess for the lack of a better description, it's a dark fantasy novel about a young girl who doesn't feel like she really fits in anywhere, and she sort of discovers a world of these strange creatures. And I mean, the tagline I always use is she makes some unusual new friends. But it ties into all of these stories that I had written very early in my career at Caliber, and ties into the Fade material that I've been developing. I mean, for pretty much 20 years now, I've been developing this character in this world and these stories. So, and it felt like the right time. I'm starting to write more comic book stories now. The Doctor Who story that I did for the Doctor Who annual went over really well. I might have a few more stories possibly in the future there. So, it was time, and I needed to find a way to be able to afford to step away from the art table long enough to finish a project. And the Kickstarter thing is very interesting. So we're about halfway through. It ends at the end of April. So hopefully we'll have the whole thing financed by then, and we're aiming to have the book come out the end of summer, and we're doing it digitally. It's going to be published through Kindle, Amazon's Kindle store, and through Apple's iBook store. So, and the only print edition of this that we currently have planned is a limited edition print run. That's just for people who pledge a certain amount on the Kickstarter page.
Excellent.
And that was a lot of twaddle. I don't know. Hopefully that makes some sort of sense.
Oh, and also,